Hello!
Hey! So in our commentary for No Lies, that we were talking about a lot about the Confederacy and some of the more sinister hidden hands that appear to be behind the Confederacy during the so-called American Civil War. And a couple of things were stuck out to me in this during this conversation we were having. And one of them is that this whole idea that we can't talk about the Rothschilds. You can't talk about the Rothschilds, and you can't talk about people like George Soros having a sinister agenda because it's anti-Semitism, and that's what the white supremacists do. When in reality, the white supremacists, who are upheld as being the faces of white supremacy and neo-Nazism in America, like David Duke and Richard Spencer, they don't even talk about the Rothschild conspiracy. They don't talk about the historical elements of this actual, like, what we're identifying as being the actual more legitimate conspiratorial elements of this. And when they do, it's all in a way designed to discredit, like the Daily Stormer does with the memes of the big hook-nosed kike with the evil grin on his face and all that, evilly plotting against the goy, the masses, and so. But David Duke has been on record. The Rothschilds are irrelevant. I doubt Richard Spencer's ever even said the word Rothschild in his life. I'm not sure about that, but it wouldn't surprise me if he never has. And so the people that are being designated as the boogeymen to keep people from getting into this stuff about, like, talking about organized Jewish interests, Jewish power that goes beyond just, like, domination of Palestine, they're not even addressing the stuff that they're used as the scapegoats to keep people from getting into.
Yes, and especially thinking about how things sort of devolve into it's sort of like a culture-based politics, and in many ways it's in the back as a resentment politics, and and I'd say, like, the average Jewish person, or the so-called little Jew, has been intensely sensitized to the image of the hook-nosed vermin kike plotting with his hands rubbing together, and so that sort of becomes, he's sort of like been completely.
What did Hitler call it? What did the Germans call it? The Der Juden, wasn't that the Nazi or the National Socialist stereotype, Der Juden?
So there's this sensitization to that where you cloak your politics and things like historical analysis and research of real people with real names, with real intentions, that can be largely proven out, with this sort of the Jew, and in a way, then you see the politics also are very quickly devolve into a divisive element, and so it's the kikes and the niggers. Those are the vermin. The niggers are too stupid to be able to know that they're inherently criminal, but in a different way than the Jews are.
Muslim swarms of invaders and the spics and all that can go in that category too.
Yeah, and it's interesting how that whole approach to so-called politics is also celebrating the massive intelligence, the manipulative genius, intelligence of the Jew, and in a certain way, it sort of like then sets it up as an impossible foe, and of course, a lot of this is based on things like IQ tests, these types of things, which I would point out have a background in with a Jewish German scientists, I believe, the IQ test. And there's most people who've investigated.
I know the bell curve. There was a lot of Jewish involvement with the bell curve, which is known as one of, like, the significant studies that was done to prove, like, the different racial differences in IQ. I know that there was a Richard Herrnstein that was associated with that, and there was even a lot of mainstream coverage for the bell curve. I don't want I don't want to name off or misname anything. I'll have to look at this and actually clarify this, but I believe it was the Atlantic. It was one of the mainstream publications did an in-depth. It might have been either the Atlantic or the New Republic did an in-depth article about the bell curve, and it wasn't entirely a negative one either. So there's a lot of mainstream backing. There's a lot of mainstream to an extent of coverage of these IQ tests and things such as the bell curve, where in a lot of ways, when you really look at it, it does benefit these various narratives that are put in place.
Yes. And in a similar way that the idea, the language about the Jew is meant to, in many ways, create and as we've seen before in history, where the little Jew or the average Jewish person of good faith is actually used as a human shield. In a similar way that the Israeli government accuses the Palestinian people of using their people as human shields, the Jewish people are a shield to the Jewish oligarchical elite, and they are sensitized. And we saw this very similarly in terms of the way that Professor Hall was attacked by the B'nai B'rith Canada as the central figure in all of that, with other players in that. And then again, let's point out that did not get almost any coverage. Democracy Now! Didn't cover it. All kinds of people didn't cover it in the United States that you would think would be interested in an attack on an indigenous studies professor, a long-term professor who's clearly an anti-racist and an anti-imperialist.
But when the Open Society Institute, when people are arrested there, Amy Goodman's all over that.
Yeah, so the way that was done in what I saw, what I see in terms of how that was done, was that it was the Jewish grassroots, supposedly coming out of the B'nai B'rith networks, chummed with this. They were put into a frenzy in a certain way by the usage of this Joshua Goldberg image and text that, of course, included words, I believe, like kikes and vermin, the Jew, the Jews, these types of things. The Holocaust didn't happen, but it should have. Killed them all. These types of. I mean, it's like, and this is, of course, Joshua Goldberg was Michael Slay, who was being given a platform at the Daily Stemme, who's given lots of play, and who's also then you see as created as the new so-called white supremacist Al Qaeda to be a digitally drone attacked and wiped off the internet. But it's not. It doesn't look like it's real. So that was interesting. So those
and from a Jewish background, just like Adam Gadon, aka Adam Perlman. There you go.
Who, Joshua Goldberg?
It's just like his case is just like the Adam Gadon case, being presented as the boogeyman.
It's interesting, yeah. And then thinking also about just finishing the thought about the way that the operation that we saw very directly in relationship to Professor Hall, where there was this chumming of the water with this clearly. Tony didn't post it. It's not even clear that his associate that he knows up in Lethbridge, whose account it was posted by, even did it himself. So this has a very shady background, this operation to post this Joshua Goldberg imagery and potentially actionable language on the image onto Tony's page, and then immediately picked up on by the B'nai B'rith Canada and used sent out on their website and probably to mailing lists, and like, look at the University of Lethbridge has a professor who has this on his page, and people like Ryan Bellerose, who is a native B'nai B'rith native Canadian B'nai B'rith employee, or he was at the time at least. He was on major CBC radio, I believe, with people like David Gray, who, by the way, has been getting deep into this the new rise of the white supremacist alt-right after Charlottesville, and who I also saw tried to conduct a and sort of anti-journalistic interview against Tony when Tony was under great threat, and Tony was able to defend himself intellectually in many ways. And I recorded the whole thing uncut so people could actually see the difference between what the fullness of the interview and then what was actually done with it and put over Canadian Broadcasting Corporation airwaves. But there was things with Ryan Bellerose and David Gray at the time where it was pretty defamatory. It was basically putting what ultimately Tony found out was Joshua Goldberg words into Professor Hall's mouth himself. And so that was sort of the chumming the Jewish waters for the attack, right? And then there's the accusation of the Holocaust denier terminology that then begins to be sort of not only further enhances the attack by the Jewish people against this apparent threat against the Jewish people, but then sets up the call for a defense. This is about those who deny our genocide, and we have to defend ourselves from them. So there's the shield. And so this is what the MO is in many ways of these kind of operations. And then at the same time, as you were pointing out, we have the way that folks like like David Duke and maybe Richard Spencer in many ways begin to put the right into a racialized box, and into a box that sort of talks about the Jew in a way that is going to also trigger the average Jewish person and is going to drive them into the hands of their closest controlled media or political operation, or into thinking that somehow the Anti-Defamation League, which comes straight out of a Judeo-Masonic secret society and has a history the B'nai B'rith itself is tied in, apparently, as I can see it, into Southern Confederacy networks, and then the Anti-Defamation League with this ongoing relationship to a domestic spy network. I don't know if it's still ongoing now. In fact, they part of the settlement, it appears, was that they were not going to be accessing information that they were not allowed to. But no one got prosecuted. This is pretty serious stuff where a domestic organization is sharing classified information in some ways, or at least information that should be private, sharing it with foreign powers, including an actual white supremacist power in South Africa at the time, and an apparent Judeo-supremacist power ongoing in Israel.
Yeah, just the irony of how somebody like how an outlet like the Daily Stormer, which of course claimed ignorance and then quote condemned Joshua Goldberg after he was outed as being a Jew, which I guess that's probably would be the real crime in the eyes of the Daily Stormer.
It wasn't the language that he was using, such as against the kill the vermin Jew kites that was being promoted on the Daily Stormer. It was the fact that he was actually a Jew, one of them.
Right. Although there's very selective reasoning for that, like Mike Enoch with his Jewish wife, who says that that the idea that Israel was involved September 11th is retarded. That's perfectly okay, or it's perfectly okay for Weave, the former Fed hacker, to post genocide memes on Daily Stormer. That's perfectly okay, but just don't get outed as a Jew,
You're right. Well, I'm out in the open. Here I am.
Exactly.
A Jew.
Yes. The irony of we got to put the 3 parentheses in the Star of David preceding your name. So,
and the Daily Stormer has to put their stamp of approval on it, I guess.
Right. Well, I don't think you're getting their stamp of approval anytime soon. I don't think you have to worry about that.
Okay.
But that's a pretty safe bet. I don't think you have to worry about getting their stamp of approval or any type of recognition from them unless they're forced to. So it would, much like Dr. Duke was triggered by Chris to respond to the 9/11 stuff when the tablet reporter jumped in, almost seemingly running defense for him. But it's funny, the irony of how these people like the Daily Storm, the folks who run the Daily Storm, are used to try to, as boogeymen, to keep people from really getting into conspiracies. When not only do they avoid these actual, like, much of the actual historical context, the valid historical context of these so-called conspiracies, but they're also actively being used to, in some ways, like with Goldberg, who was with the Daily Stormer, and then apparently, by all evidence out there, was used as a means to try to destroy Tony Hall's career. They're actually used as attack dogs against those who are exposing this stuff, who are actually giving a rational and realistic based approach to these issues of deep politics and of deep historical meaning and understanding of these of how these power structures operate. There's a real irony there, but you even go beyond that, and one of David Duke's criticisms of Alex Jones that I remember before he went on the Alex Jones show back in 2015, just before the Trump phenomenon really began, is that Alex Jones, he focuses on the Bilderberg group and on all these secret societies. Folks, it's not secret societies. You don't have to worry about these groups like the Bilderbergs that are running things. Let's understand, the Jew is the problem, and Alex Jones is keeping you away from that. There's an ulterior motive, I think, and even and a lot of these people that like to criticize Alex Jones because he doesn't go after the Jew. Not everybody, because there are a lot of people that are actually critical of Alex Jones properly for not addressing the Israeli role in September 11th, the Israeli role in terms of dominating dialogue and discourse and various levers of power, but in the way like a David Duke does it, he's like doing it in a way that will keep people from you shouldn't even look at the Bilderberg group and understand how a group like the Bilderbergs operate because it's irrelevant. Much like saying that the Rothschilds are irrelevant, this is actually keeping people away from understanding a lot of these power dynamics that Alex Jones actually, in some ways, in the past, has done some decent work on exposing. And other people have done a much better job of exposing.
It's a good point. It makes me think again about the choice of Alex Jones to have Duke on to discuss these issues. And while in the midst of his ongoing backtracking away from the actual factual nature of the truth of September 11th, where he could have had on someone like Kevin Barrett or Christopher Bolin, who actually know the facts behind the September 11th.
Yeah, I want to throw in real quick that David Duke did interviews with Alex Jones and Cenk Uygur within like 5 months of each other. Both hotly contested, hot interviews that got very heated and also got a lot of views online. So,
yeah. So I would, in this sort of vein, I'm interested in. I think this guy, Chris Cantwell, is that his name?
Christopher Cantwell, the crying neo-Nazi, yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting how focused on he was in all of this. I think it was an interesting decision. I think and I know like probably people like Abby Martin probably would be completely against this, that people like Dan Dix at Press for Truth, or I think her name is Karen Strawn at Girl Writes What, I think it's called. They both interviewed Cantwell in the wake of him being focused on and being arrested. And I think although I think he's wrong about a lot of things, and I don't know the nature of his good faith, I do think that the fact that the way he portrays that he is convinced by reasoning and that he's interested in people convincing him that he's seeing this in the wrong way and that he's evolved this perspective is an interesting perspective. I think he's gotten himself into a deep box, if he's for real, where he is sort of tied up in that side of the controlled opposition in terms of his understanding of the Charlottesville event, his understanding of the car attack, his understanding of the left, and then of his openness to sort of the IQ standard of intelligence and the idea of biological criminality that's tied into both black folks and Jewish folks, and that I think that looking at that would be an interesting thing. Well, I think that we need to have debates. I think we need to have open debates, and that in the midst of all this, while everybody from the Unite the Right and the alt-right and the alt-light and the Antifa and the foundation-backed left is calling for getting out on the streets and confronting people in the streets and protecting our statues on the streets, I'm actually saying, that's been the talking point. Whether it's the women's march after Trump or the resist movement, that it's all about taking the streets. No, I really think that the what is going to hold here is fierce discourse. Let it be combative. Let it be intensely combative. And so more and more, my suspicion is going to be towards those who are unwilling to have a conversation out in the public about politics and about historical issues of fact, contentious no matter what they are. And I would say, instead of storming the streets, why don't we organize assemblies? Why don't we organize real speaking events? Not rallies. Sure, of course, people have a right to do a rally. People have a right to do a march. People have a right to do a protest. People have a right to do a counter-protest. But the First Amendment that's not its core. Its core is about the deliberative function, the deep deliberative function that is the fundamental origin of any legitimate idea of governance. And it's also very tied into the idea of voluntarism, right? That you can have government and voluntarism together. And that the way to do it is that the government cannot stand over the people. The people have to stand below the government and to not allow its any power to restrict its power when it tries to dominate it. And by standing below, I don't mean under in terms of a hierarchy of command. I mean in terms of the actual source of its sovereignty and its legitimacy. So that the power is in the hands of we the people. But the power is only in the hands of we the people if we make it so. And this, of course, has been the false image or the false idol of democracy that's been proposed to us in the last couple hundred years. It's very divided in a lot of the West. It's intensely dualistic. It's dialectically controlled. It's again back to the Masonic chessboard. It's the black and the white. It's the left and the right. It's the Dems. It's the Republicans. That is a great way to get people to bicker while having people pull strings on both sides. The best way for we, the people, to actually have the democratic component of a constitutional republic, which is based on not law and order, and not even just on rule of law, but on principled rule of law. That's why we have such things as the idea of a jury, the power of a jury. And ultimately, those powers go back to the ultimate veto power on the totality of the government's policies. And of course, there's certain groups that are very wary of people understanding the power of the jury, and that it's not only the facts of the case, it's also the legitimacy of the law that's under question by 12 rational people of the current society in terms of a jury. So. But even below, meaning even more fundamental or even more original or powerful, a source of our people's power, our democratic power, I want to call it actually, before government is the deliberative faculties of the people. And this goes way back in our history. This is in terms of the real tribal relationships where the people sat together. And the elders sat together, and they held a different function in certain ways, or they held a piece of the puzzle. They knew the history better than the sort of upcoming middle agers and the younger people. And they held a certain function, and the people who are maybe heading up into the sort of power positions in the middle of their lives, they were a certain kind of leader. The young people were not shunted out of the meetings. They were part of the process. They were not only being educated to the principles and the history of the group and the tribe, but they were also a source of new possibilities and a source of maybe we've done this like this, but maybe we could do this better, that type of thing. So I would propose that the assembly. This is not the crowd. We've talked a lot, we've been told a lot, we've been marketed to a lot increasingly in this sort of mega corporate digital age about the intelligence of the crowd or crowdfunding. But the crowd is just the crowd, and the rally is still sort of mainly its logic is based on the crowd, and the march is still a little more organized, but it's still the crowd. The assembly is a higher order of cooperative intelligence that respects the uniqueness of every individual, bringing some piece of information or analysis or an intelligent thought or idea to the table. So assembly, the logic of the assembly. Of course, this is not only about getting together to discuss politics, local issues of very direct things. This is the other thing. Is like, okay, so Christopher Cantwell's gonna sort of float off on something where it's about some type of racial nation that he admits is how are you gonna get there? And instead of why not? If you want to recuperate and regenerate what you see as your proud European roots, and that's a dignified and a very respectful and respectable and powerful thing to do, of course, because the idea of the cloaking or the cultural tyranny of the empire goes way back in European history. In relationship to imperial overlays of different ethnic and tribal and regional, local, religious and political structures. And so reviving your sense of pride in your own background and the cultural forms of your people's background, that sounds like a very interesting and important thing to be doing at this point. But for it to be all about sort of massing around some statue, rather than let me see, where is your permaculture farm, or where is your permaculture urban farm with your neighbors who have sort of bought in together and are controlling land and space together? Or even if you're renting, you're amassing with the people that you see as your cultural allies or your ethnic allies, and where is the leadership and the meetings and the visions of the future? And it's sort of crazy. Like, there's still ongoing weaponization of the air, geoengineering. There's weaponization of the water. There's weaponization of the food, and you want to chat about some statue. Where are the examples? And I'm not talking about dropping out either, because that was sort of a thing pushed in the 60s, which was actually some type of mind control that was meant to disrupt the politically connected anti-war part of the rising people's movement in the 60s, was to divide it into you're either an urban hippie with dropping acid at the Grateful Dead, and you've forgotten all about the Vietnam War, and it's all about your hairstyle and your bell-bottom jeans, or you've dropped out and you're trying to work on a commune out in the woods, and politics is for the man, bro. Politics is where the man wants you, or you're in that kind of situation. So no, what I'm talking about is the real people who are trying to resurrect or create power, revitalize their European roots, and are not going to be sort of guilted and shamed for being who they are or coming where they come from, nor are they going to be divided and told what it means to be a good man or woman of European background by oligarchical organizations, many of them Jewish dominated. So the actual real solution in all of this is, let's see the modeling. Let's see the modeling of the kind of society that you're proposing, and I would hold myself to that a similar vision and calling. And I'm not. I don't believe in a racial politics or an ethnic politics. I think that that's a model that is not, not dissimilarly to Richard Spencer. I don't think that the Judeo-centric, in many ways, Jewish supremacist Zionist project is a model of anything that I want to try to resurrect. And I mean, I have called myself in the past, I played around with the nomenclature of Zionist of conscience, because in a similar fashion to what we're talking about right now in terms of people of European descent, I understand what the Jewish desire for a home or a nationalism is and was. At the same time, I've always been against the idea of an ethno-religio-centric or supremacist state. And as you can see, that it's a false idol. State power is a false idol that causes Jewish people of good faith to sit on their hands at best when a regime that supports the white supremacism and dictators of all stripes all over the world. You sent me that article that's in the 972 that, forget Trump, think about Israel's backing of some of the worst governments around the world, including relationships with Argentinian junta,
the notorious German war criminal Klaus Barbie, who was I believe he was higher up within the Chilean establishment in Israel, was supported the regime in Chile at that time, and Klaus Barbie, notorious war criminal, was serving was directly involved at a very high level with the Chilean government at the time.
Yes. So so this idea of a Zionist of conscience, I understand also that there's probably a lot of people, including many Palestinian people, who would hear Zionist of conscience in a similar way that your average Jewish person would hear a Nazi of conscience. At the same time, I think the idea of, if I heard that there were a Nazi of conscience, if let's say Christopher Cantwell came out and said, I've come down to it, I am a Nazi of conscience. And then he explained himself, and he talked about the parts of National Socialist Germany that he thought were interesting in terms of certain parts of technological organization or cultural pride of certain sorts. And then he criticized the parts that he thought were wrong in terms of the sort of supremacist aspects, the rounding up of the unwanted, whether it was Jews or handicapped or people of the communist background potentially, or gypsies or that type of thing, and put in political concentration, ethnic concentration camps. And the death and destruction that was widespread in relationship to some of these movements, in relationship to the whole world, that included Russia, that included how many people did the United States kill? How many people did Japan kill? I mean, there's sort of this is not. I don't want to pick a side amongst people who believe that mass violent death is the right way to go, because it's not. It's not, and it doesn't have to happen. I'm not saying that violence, defensive violence, is never okay, because it clearly is. But it has to be defensive, and it has to be very legitimate, and it has to be the only way out, I would say, too. And so in many ways you can see war in terms of we the people's perspective. And yes, there's tons of orchestration and high-level conspiracy going on in relationship to getting people into war. But in terms of we the people, war is almost always the failure of politics. That's the way I see it. War is not politics is not war by another name, or war is not politics by another name, but war is the failure of politics. So let's get political. Let's get really political. That means talking to each other. And I would just point out, I think that I saw an interview of Dan Dix on Press for Truth with Cynthia McKinney, and what I'm hearing her articulate about her approach to the unrig proposal is very grounded in principled political strategy, where she's calling.
Oh, we're going to find some people who are going to disagree with us on this, but go ahead.
Well, I don't know if there's anybody who's going to disagree about the actual specifics of her proposal. I'm sure there'll be people that call into question her judgment, her political judgment, or what she's doing in relationship to some of the statements. I agree. Or what people are saying Steele is actually trying to use her for. But what I'm hearing her say is that she wants to have an actual discussion across the political spectrum, and she's calling for what she calls power cells, preferably at least one in every single congressional district in the country. And you could further, of course, I would say, let's further divide that up once we get there, in terms of let's hyper-localize our political power and then scale it up in relationship to good ideas. You could have neighborhood assemblies and power cells. And she's calling, let's make sure we have all the people of different political persuasions at the table, sitting down to actually speak with each other about where are the agreements. Yes, we should not try to cover up or bulldoze our disagreements or our unique identities, and that includes of people of all unique identities, not just people of color, right? And,
absolutely.
And Cynthia McKinney would acknowledges and respects the idea of everybody's unique identity, and that actually, and I think she puts it in a similar type of way that I talked about our history in the tribal councils, where our difference actually is respected and brought to the table as a potential powerful cooperative asset rather than shunned, which I would point out, which is a lot of what the Jewish community is dealing with and has historically dealt with. That the naysayers or the serious critics or those of a different prophetic background are shunned or are called names or are accused of being a self-hating Jew or just an asset of the Jew haters or not a Jew anymore. And so I want there to be a serious reckoning in the Jewish community with the no. We are here. There's many different people of Jewish descent or background, whether we identify in terms of ethnically or culturally, and we have family who we know and love who have taught us a lot about the idea of dialogue and a deep compassion for humanity as a whole and our own humanity and humor. Or whether it's a deep commitment to certain core religious relationships to a higher power, or these types of things. And this, of course, is what political Zionism has in many ways been a fraudulent icon, a golden calf of some sort, for mainly in relationship to these sort of hardline orthodox, the sort of orthodox militant groups like Chabad in some way, and also the secularized, only culturally Jews who see in it their insurance Israel as some type of insurance policy and some type of child that they need to protect, and thus we're willing to do anything and violate all ethical and national principles if necessary, or sign off on something like that.
Jeremy, this almost sounds like an actual, like a legitimate responsibility of intellectuals you're laying out here, just without the hypocrisy and the selective choosing of when to and when not to actually discuss and explore possible uncomfortable facts, like Noam Chomsky, who of course was the original writer of The Responsibility of Intellectuals. That sounds like what you're laying out here, an actual responsibility of intellectuals that is principled and uncompromising. So that's what it sounds like you're laying out here, and I think it's great.
Yes, and maybe we could expand the idea of the intellectual into the intellectuals, and even beyond that, the responsibility of our intellectual functions and distribution, the intellectual genius of the human species is spread amongst all of us. And this, of course, is where you get into the major problems, I think, with the people who believe they know how best to do eugenics from whatever background they're from. These people who are so-called retarded, or these people who have physical deformities, or these people who have different mental, what might be called aberrations, or or that type of thing. These are people who are going to pollute our gene pool. And many times what you really see is that the nature has a very powerful underlying logic, including human genetic nature, where our outliers hold key pieces. They hold key pieces. I was just reading through one of the more extensive stories on the Israeli teen. And I just point out too, I've been reading a lot of sort of academic progressive Jews who are linking to stories that talk about the rise of the anti-Semitism in relationship to Charlottesville, and mention these hundreds of threats against the JCCs, and still are failing to mention that the literal fact of the matter, even though we haven't yet figured out exactly what the nature of it is, the literal fact of the matter is that the months-long, years-long, actually, I think it's their ways, and it's not hundreds, I guess it was thousands in terms of it. We went beyond the JCC, Jewish communities in the United States. It was countries around the world, including amongst the Five Eyes and the British Commonwealth and stuff like that. There was thousands of these. This is coming factually, literally, geographically from Israel. From Israel. That should be a interesting, deep question that Jews should be asking themselves, especially Jews in America. Is there, and you see this is Finkelstein in the defamation movie. He's like, where is the next Shoah? Where is the next Holocaust? Is it coming around the corner? We're here in America. We've never had it better. And he's right. He's right. It's a fraud. And this, of course, is what aspects of the sort of Zionist oligarchical power network, most intensely concentrated in Israel, but also spread around the world in terms of some of these high-level positions in very powerful areas, are worried about the Jewish American people. And that's why it's very possibly that there is a background in terms of these threats, that this young Israeli guy, he's Israeli American, he spent some time in the United States, and the reason I brought this up is that he has some type of autism, and he had a brain tumor, and it affected his, this is what's said by his parents, it affects his social relationships. At the same time, he was apparently a sort of a visual genius of some sort, and putting together 100-piece jigsaw puzzles when he was 1 year old, and being able to do major mathematical numbers when he was 3, and then you see a picture of a map, a very precise map that he made. So he's mapping things too. So back to this article about Unit 9900. About the visual intelligence unit of the Israeli military, that they have a program for autistic kids, and I imagine that's probably sounds like in some area of mapping. So my thought, and it was a sort of tangential thought in relationship to that, is that that people like that who are maybe have a hard time socially or are different socially hold key intelligences. So this whole idea of the IQ or the, of a single line of intelligence that's decided by a single Jewish German scientist, these are, they could be considered one piece amongst many in terms of our understanding of deep human intelligence. Of course, we know there's emotional intelligence, but there's multiple forms of intellectual intelligence. And so I would ask some of the Jewish American people to very quickly get up to speed on some of this history that we've been talking about, and to look into this story and to be honest about where did the predominant, at the very least, if not most, if not all, of all these serious threats against Jewish people in Jewish community centers in North America and around the world come from, and why? And why did Netanyahu not say anything about it when he was with Trump at the press conference? And why is he not saying shit now? Right, go for it.
To condemn Charlottesville. I mean, he hasn't condemned Charlottesville. His son came out and said that it was the BLM and the Antifas are the real problems. The Nazis are a thing of the past. The real threat to my people are the Antifas and the BLM people, and that's the same thing Alan Dershowitz said. Alan Dershowitz, who's been defending Trump, said the same thing. Even Naftali Bennett, who initially did come out and criticize Trump's response to Charlottesville, he came out saying the same thing. The real threat is from the Antifas and the BLM. This shows that there is definitely elements within this power configuration, whatever you want to call it, maybe the Zionist power configuration, as James Petras calls it, that is supportive of this right wing Charlottesville, all this provocateuring that's going on. They certainly see it as beneficial, and we were talking about this from the moment that the Berkeley protests were planned, with Milo going out there on his big speaking tour. On his, what he called the dangerous faggot tour or whatever, and how this all was manufactured. And, the idea of being woke, everybody likes to say that they're woke, the right, they like to talk about how woke they are. The left likes to talk about how woke they are, how aware they are. We're so woke, we're the ones telling the truth. We're out here fighting the good fight against the evildoers, against the bad people, the intolerant ones. We're woke because we're out here at the Women's March. We've got our, hats on with vaginas on it or whatever, and we're the ones out here chanting, fuck Donald Trump, no, whatever the coined catchphrases are. We're the woke ones, or the woke ones are the ones who are at the Sharia law protests and are the ones that are out there chanting the Goyim no, and Jews will not replace us at a candlelight vigil is reminiscent of the 1920s Klan rally.
Tiki torches. I wonder if they came from Jewish billionaire Zionist owned Home Depot.
Maybe the same ones that are going to build the wall that all these white nationalists are so excited about.
The Lockheed Martin cubic Israeli contractor built wall that.
Yeah, that wall.
That Trump's going to shut down the U.S. government in order to finance before he gets Mexico to finance it.
Good luck trying to get over that wall in the case of like a complete financial collapse, though.
Or a natural disaster or a cosmic disaster.
Yeah.
So.
But is that woke? I mean, are these people really woke, or is woke what we're talking about here? And I'm not trying to say we're better than anybody, because we're not. But I mean, are these people woke? I mean, are these people more woke than the ones who want to have a real conversation about these subjects of vital importance? And I mean, people are getting caught up in these traps of wanting to be part of something, and to the point to where I think at this point, going out in the streets and being part of any of these protests, unless you're there really just to try and actually push back against the rhetoric that's being promoted at any of these rallies, whether we're talking about an alt-right rally or an alt-light rally or a resistance rally or an Antifa rally, I think it's a major trap that's going to end up dragging us down and actually sapping productivity. And unless we're there to confront these false narratives that are being put out at these rallies, I don't believe we're going to have much of an effect. And now there's talk of Free Speech Week with Steve Bannon and Milo and Ann Coulter being invited out to Berkeley next month. Ben Shapiro is planning to go out there and speak. I don't know if he's still planning on it or not. But anyone should be able to see that this is a trap, that this is where, quote, they, we always talk about the people in power, they want people to be out in the streets doing this stuff. They want people out there clashing with the Antifas and the white nationalists. They don't have a problem with you out there chanting, the Goyim, no, Jews will not replace us, resist, no Trump, no KKK, no fascist USA. They want you to chant that stuff. They want you at these events. They want you listening to Richard Spencer or Andrew Anglin. They want you listening to Linda Sarsour and the Antifas, and that's where they want you to be. Where they don't want you to be is actually pushing back against this rhetoric and not getting caught up into these boxes.
Great points, Greg, and I think you're right, and that yes, direct action and protest and rallies can be really, really powerful, but not if they're confused or set up to fail or set up to explode in some way. Like, think about the possibility of, I can imagine two, like, statue rally type, situations. Like, I think it would be interesting if the District of Columbia City Council organizes in relationship to the the Pike statue in the heart of D.C., and to then set up an actual teach-in around that.
And in addition to writing all of the literature about the three world wars and predicting World War, we're supposed to follow the first two world wars, Albert Pike's name also figures into all this discussion of B'nai B'rith involvement in the Confederacy. So
although I have not yet seen the copy of that letter, and I guess it's supposedly housed at I think it's housed in a British museum. I don't know the nature of that. It is everybody admits he was high level Scottish Freemason, Scottish Rite Freemason. There's some dispute about his role in the KKK, but what we can see from that history, at the very least, should be drawn out. Get the best scholars. Yeah. Get the best scholars to do a teach-in about this history. And then, another interesting thing would be the Jews of conscience.
Well, Ken Burns won't be doing it, so we'll have to find other people.
Right. And the Jews of conscience who reject the hate managers and the hate pimps at the SPLC and the so-called ADL might want to organize a rally in relationship to a statue that they might be able to find of maybe a Judah Benjamin or a Simon Wolf, and do a teach-in there and talk about what is the core of the Jewish people, what is the nature of Jewish people's ethics and principles.
Even if Bernard Baruch's grandfather was involved in all this stuff, as one of these articles identified Bernard Baruch's grandfather, are there anything named after Bernard Baruch that we could start going and trying to raise awareness to?
I forgot. That is another key piece. What was? You remember what his grandfather's name was? It was the same time though, right? He was in the mix in relationship to these Southern Confederate B'nai B'rith associated leadership guys. And
name escapes me.
And isn't it the case that Simon Wolf was then hooked up at, I think it was the 1850 or 1860 Democratic National Convention with the direct political operative operating
August
under
Belmont.
August Belmont, who was recognized as a American representative from the Rothschilds in the United States of America.
being another elitist family, the Belmont Stakes horse race every year named after the Belmont family. So there you go with more power. There's a university in Tennessee named after the Belmonts. So funny how that works.
Yes. But I think you're completely right about let's take woke to the next level. Alt woke or whatever, the alt middle. But see, again,
actually a good term, hashtag alt woke. I like that.
And again, like all these terminology, it's interesting. The hashtag is an interesting phenomena. It reminds you that words and ideas can potentially create action, and the actions could go in many ways. So I think it's important to not be afraid of terminology, to use terminology, and at the same time to not idolize terminology. And again, to remind ourselves that in terms of intellect and in understanding and language, it's really not the terminology that's the most important thing. That's not what should decide what the nature of our disagreement is, or our differences, or our agreement and our unity. The nature of it should be very specific description about what we're talking about, whether it's about the history, so the idea of facts that can then be under dispute or disproven or proven, or whether it's about thick descriptions in an anthropological sense of what we're actually seeing in our own society, and then also...
No topic should be off limits. That's our thing. Like, nothing should be forbidden to talk about.
No, and at the same time, we choose to decide what we're going to spend our time on, what we're going to spend our focus on, and so that part of that has to do with spending our time in a way that's productive and in a way where we actually clarify the matter. Use terms, if you're going to use them, to help explain yourself. Use them as a touch point to explain your actual ideas, your actual political and philosophical and ethical commitments. Not as if someone understands, oh, he's alt-right, or he's a white nationalist, oh, she's left, she's a Marxist, oh, she's a Maoist. No, think for yourself. Think for yourself. There's still ideas that have never been yet expressed, and they're waiting for the 20 people living here in the 21st century to not just be dependent on whatever, Karl Marx or Smith or Hobbes or the Austrian school. No, we here, let's say the United States of America, there's some people here, we have some ideas, let's develop them, and let's not be sort of, have this albatross or this weight around our ankles of the past. Let's understand the past. Let's not be afraid of the past. Let's uncover the past. Let's use good ideas and history that we're proud of from the past, while exposing bad ideas and history that we're not proud of from the past, while at the same time knowing that no one else in history has ever been who we are, or has ever lived through what we're doing, and we're not just spectators. We are an audience, like an assembly has an audience, but we're also the participants too. And an assembly is the key image there. We're both the participant, the speaker, and the audience, the listener. So,
yeah. Speaking of the past, it's amazing how you just continue to increase your understanding and awareness of various matters as you develop and you continue to learn about things. And honestly, one of the areas where, for the longest time, much like I foolishly bought into the idea that Donald Trump was, in a lot of ways, the anti-establishment candidate, that he was the guy who everybody wanted to stop because of the way that the narrative was established around it. For a long time, I was a believer. I was more or less, this is a little more controversial, I think, but I was more or less a believer in a lot of the history that, the Confederacy was wrongly vilified, and that it really was a war of northern aggression. The Ron Paul idea that Lincoln was really a tyrant, he didn't want to stop slavery, and that the Civil War could have been ended without slavery, which is all true, but I think it takes a turn, and I think we're seeing this with this Confederate monument controversy. I think it takes a somewhat dangerous turn when we, just like with other groups, when we get into like this historical just deification of the South and of the Confederacy, which a lot of people, especially in that part of the country, are doing. But more or less, I think that you're seeing more or less of that stance being taken by conservative-minded people everywhere, that these people really are to be deified as being the real heroes, when you don't take into account, and deliberately it's kept away from us. Like, we're not finding out about a lot of this stuff until just recently with the significant involvement of the B'nai B'rith and of the Rothschild-connected establishment with the Confederacy, the highest ranks of the Confederacy, and even involved in possibly using Confederate or Rothschild-affiliated Confederate assets within the Confederacy to actually assassinate the President of the United States. So we're in this process, I think a lot of the psychological elements of sympathy with your history of your country, and this is our history, we can't destroy our history, combined with the rose-colored glasses view of the Confederacy because of how the counter narrative has been established. I think it's created I would warn people against deifying this Confederacy as being the answer to the anything that all of the bad things that Lincoln did and other Northerners did. But let's be careful not to deify the South, because I don't think with this deification of the Confederacy that this monument thing would be such an emotional issue for people, to the point to where we're risking all-out domestic chaos to protect monuments, with, of course, the usual agent provocateur types leading the charge to save our heritage and don't destroy our heroes' statues. These were the real heroes that were just to fight against the tyranny that was imposed upon them.
Yes, and this is also, I think what you're also talking about, and the way I'm understanding it too, is the idea of having a complex understanding, be open to different potentials of understanding, rather than sort of this side good, that side bad, or that's
It's a lot like the whole thing with Russia, where like we can be critically skeptical and critical of the obvious close relationship that Vladimir Putin has with prominent Israelis and also prominent, Shabbat Lubavitch figures with significant connections to Israel as well as to the Trump family, but without like pushing the mainstream, being careful not to push the mainstream, like much of the establishment narrative about Russia that is going on here in the U.S. It's the same way with the Confederacy. Like, we don't want to just like parrot the mainstream talking points. Oh, well, the Confederacy was just represented by a bunch of evil, racist, slave-holding supremacists who were just wanted to oppress everybody who didn't look like them. But at the same time, though, there are reasons to be critical of this narrative of this deification that has developed in a lot of circles around the Confederacy, but for reasons that are not being disclosed within the preconceived narrative that's set up for us.
Yes, and then that would even play into thinking about through the things like the American Revolution and the foundation of our government and the different factions potentially and different principles at play and all of that, and to allow ourselves to not throw babies out with the bathwater, while also not, like you said, using rose-colored glasses, and and thinking through the founding fathers, as they're called, and thinking I've sort of come to understand a three-part factional basis in many ways that are still in many ways struggling in relationship to what is the United States of America. What kind of country are we? And of course you have aspects, the people who were the loyal royalists, people who did not want to leave the British Empire, certain of the colonists. Then there were those who wanted to set up a new monarchy or a new oligarchy of a new aristocracy of the landed elite, and part of that was slavery. Part of that was a commitment to slavery, or at the very least we can't deal with that now, even though it might be a bad. And there's different elements among that crew. And then I think there's a third faction that's underemphasized by those that talk about the framers or the founding fathers, that actually had to do with the best of the Enlightenment tradition and the ideas of inherent God-given rights. I believe that this is sort of what a large portion of the importance of the Bill of Rights comes out of, and that without the Bill of Rights, the Constitution is an interesting division of administrative labor. But the principles, the commitment to the rights of we the people is not there, and so there's other people that represent And I'd say a lot of these people, and because they understood the inherent right of the individual, God-given, that was inherently conflicted with the idea of certain people because of their or national origins or their ethnic background were lesser people or deserved a lesser chance at their lives. So, and I sort of think of people like Thomas Paine as the most indicative of that group, and some of his ideas were hundreds of years ahead of their time, and some of them still should be looked into for possible philosophical background for policy in the 21st century.
Indeed, and it's not so much the idea of having it's perfectly fine I think it's perfectly fine for, say, people who descended from Confederate veterans, from people who died in the Civil War, representing on one side or the other, representing the South and the West. It's perfectly fine to be proud of your heritage and even in some cases, I know it's portrayed as being the most evil thing in the world to do, but there's nothing wrong with there's nothing wrong with descendants of Confederate soldiers honoring their loved one, or those who preceded them who died for this cause. I mean, but at the same time, though, it's like being careful, to be able to see a big enough picture of how a lot of history works, and how a lot of these actual really deep involvement by elite figures that can easily subvert and pervert a movement. And just not falling into the deification of this, and understanding that there are flaws associated with every movement. So while you can celebrate your past, celebrate your heritage, don't get involved in the deification of this, which I believe is creating this emotional reaction, which has been set up over the years, just like the very carefully crafted quote-unquote establishment narrative of the Civil War and of the South as being the evil aggressors and the evil racists who just wanted to leave the Union. They were the traitors who were turning their back on their country, and they're the evil ones, and this war had to be fought, and Lincoln had to do what he had to do. Don't question Lincoln's motives. Just like that narrative's been carefully crafted. On the other side, this careful narrative has been crafted of the South as the great ultimate heroes who were really in the right to destroy those who were trying to oppress them and keep them from living their free will. And so be proud of who you are, be proud of where you came from, but don't fall into these traps of just deification, because it creates these emotional that allow these events that are easily being manufactured to to proceed and to be carried out.
That's a good point. And the combination of, I think, pride is an important function of the human dignity and spirit, but if it's not tempered with humility and self-analysis, it becomes toxic. And there's no more toxic, or there's few more toxic psychological combinations than what I would say that we, the Jewish people, are dealing with right now, which is a combination of privilege plus a victim mentality, plus a supremacist
mindset,
subconscious mindset for many.
There you go,
subconscious Jews. Yeah, mindset. And of course, a lot of that the supremacism is outwardly expressed by certain elements of so-called Jewish leaderships, whether in the Jewish state or beyond. That some of that does go back to books, religious books. And that's something that Jewish people of conscience should openly struggle with. And my claim is that I've talked about Jewish privilege now more and more, and thought about it, and I've spoken with a few people about it, and I've spoke to an African American woman activist and journalist. And talked about it, whether a concept like that would be helpful, if she thought something like that would be helpful, in addition to a concept like white privilege, in thinking through certain things that her community was thinking through. And she was like, yes, that would be very helpful, especially if the Jewish community would embrace it. And I've come up with a concept that there's a lot of denial, even in very truth-oriented and progressive circles, about the idea of Jewish privilege as being something that exists or something that might be unique. And so I've termed it that Jewish privilege is the right to eat your cake and deny that you have it too.
It's just like how white privilege is classified in a lot of ways. But I think on that note, I think this is a pretty good time to bring this impromptu conversation to it, and kind of an extension of what we broadcasted for No Lies Radio. I hope this makes up for our absence the last couple of weeks. I hope everybody gets a lot out of this. And real quick, Afghanistan. The paradigms, the idea that one side, that this troop surge, and that those who are opposing the troop surge have the patriotic response to it. I don't think that's exactly true.
Yeah, this is on the surface of it, it looks like pretty much Trump's Obama moment. At the end of 2009, Obama was properly educated to the position that in following with his advisor, the head of the CFR, what's his name again? Do you remember?
Richard Haas.
Richard Haas wrote the book that was sort of the foundation for Obama's approach to foreign policy and war and peace. The wars of choice and wars of necessity. And Iraq was the war of choice, and Afghanistan was the war of necessity because of, guess what, 9/11. And then at the end of 2009, Obama...
The Zbigniew Brzezinski grand chessboard made it necessary, and 9/11 just put the icing on the cake.
Yeah, a good point. And so Obama announced the surge. It was it was going to draw down in Iraq, but surge in Afghanistan. And so here is Trump, after much deliberation, saying that he was against further intervention. He's been convinced that we can't abandon Afghanistan, and we have to win the war somehow. And again, this goes back to what we talked about, the neocon 2.0 doctrine. It's basically just a change in wording about the justification of it. No matter how much Alex Jones says that he's got inside information from insiders that he won't disclose that says this is four-dimensional chess, maybe there's aspects of it that are...
I think it's more like different power.
Yes,
elements of power.
And it's differently explained.
Donald Trump, that's what it is.
Yeah, and it's justified by we're not trying to create a stable democratic government in Afghanistan that's good for women and education. This is about really defeating the Taliban, even though it's always it's the same scenario. And of course, it's 9/11. Trump had his 9/11 9/11 lie, his treason moment. The most mega treason moment. This is when Obama doubled down in justification by 9/11 on Afghanistan. I called into C-SPAN and said that he'd followed up on George W. Bush's commitment to a treasonous policy based on the lies of September 11th. And for Alex Jones to sort of completely go blank, not only after he had him on his show, when Trump was on Alex's show, blaming bin Laden for 9/11.
I won't let you down. You'll be very proud of me, Alex.
And Trump was right. And Alex, didn't ask Trump to come on and hold his feet to the fire right after he came into office, when he could have put the things on the table that would have been a real We the People populist agenda that would include things like, some law and order around things like 9/11 treason might be a start to a rational foreign and domestic policy. But no, Alex let him out of that because he didn't owe it to him. He just wanted, if it was good for the country, then just go on and do it.
But the evil leftists in the streets justify the continued law enforcement elements in areas that's actually going to increase the power of the same domestic federal government entity that Alex claims to hate so much. But the evil leftists make that a necessity. So don't worry about 9/11 truth. We've got all these Antifas roaming the streets. They need to have their heads. Their skulls cracked by these law enforcement officers.
And so Trump is now an open statement of being on the side of 9/11 treason, and more than Obama, we know that Trump we see the video that Alex used to say Trump's actually a 9/11 truther. He's not with Larry Silverstein because he said that the buildings had been blown up. It's true. Trump did say that. He never said it again. He never publicly stated the implications of that. He did spend a lot of time on Joe Arpaio's cold case posse and the Israeli dentist from Orange County, the theories about Obama and the birth certificate. Some of that is factual. Obama does have a history that's been untold so far, and I believe it tracks back to Kansas. But this idea that Alex pursued, not about September 11th and where is Trump on 9/11 truth, but Trump on the birth certificate, Trump on Sheriff Arpaio, the great patriot fascist. So this is a moment of truth. This is a moment of clarity. And apparently the truth about the most singular, most treasonous event in the history of our country, it is September 11th. And it's still waiting to be fully accounted for. And Trump has decided to team up very frontally with covering up, at the very least covering up, if not completely down with, and taking commands from people who see that as just one step along the treasonous pathway for the United States of America, and that includes the death and destruction of millions of, might I say, Semitic people around the world.
And it's funny, though, we talked about I mentioned the dueling elements within like these power circles that are competing to influence Donald Trump, who is increasingly looking more and more just like a complete empty suit, who's just in over his head, who really doesn't have any real significant understanding of anything that's really going on, particularly with regards to foreign policy, which is why he's so easily swayed. It's what Netanyahu said about the Americans can be swayed. Well, I think Donald Trump can easily be swayed, and he's got these competing factions that are trying to sway him. He was clearly elected in large part because of a propaganda network that was led by these elements that emanate and originate out of right-wing Zionist circles, emanating out of this nation of Israel, places like Breitbart and Drudge Report and Gateway Pundit, to name a few. But also Trump has had those who want to keep the status quo in place in terms Israel policy, Iran policy, don't want to rip up this nuclear deal and ratchet up the tensions there, want to keep the military presence in Afghanistan to protect the drug supply and the minerals or whatever, all the money that's coming from that stuff. And it seems at this point, at this moment in time, that faction seems to be winning out over the faction that wants Donald Trump to move the embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which would cause all hell to break out in the Middle East, or to allow unlimited Israeli settlement building, Israel to give whatever it wants to do, free reign to do whatever on a domestic level, extreme right-wing domestic policies, rip up the Iran deal. And one of the other aspects that this faction that seems to be losing out is that with regards to Afghanistan, wanted to replace the military presence with private contractors led by people such as Eric Prince of Blackwater Infamy, and the idea that these so-called patriots are presenting this as an actual viable alternative. It amazes me. It doesn't amaze me at the same time, but it's such a deception.
Yeah, it's again similarly to the way we understood aspects of these sort of different parties in the Trump administration, that this looks to be a similar type of approach. Whether it's are we going to go with the increase the troops in Afghanistan, or are we going to go with increase the contractors plan? And I think you're right that in the mix of that is something that pleases all of some of the bad parties here, whether it's the drug trade or the continued presence of bases in Afghanistan.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I do think it's been very enjoyable. I'm glad to get back into the swing of things with you after our absence. So we're hoping that this impromptu conversation kind of makes up for time we've been away. So hope everybody gets something out of this. And Jeremy, thanks for doing this with me.
Thank you, Greg. Bye-bye.
All right.